When Whitney Houston walked onto the Bodyguard set that first morning in November 1991, she had no idea she was about to meet the man who would become the love of her life. Kevin Costner was already there, reviewing the shooting schedule, when he heard her voice echoing from the makeup trailer. He stopped mid-sentence and turned to his assistant. "Is that her?" But nothing could have prepared him for what happened when their eyes met for the first time. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss these incredible untold stories from music's greatest legends. And let me know in the comments if you've ever experienced a connection so powerful, it changed everything. Kevin had fought the studio for months to cast Whitney as Rachel Marin. Warner Brothers wanted Michelle Pfeiffer or Meg Ryan, established actresses who were bankable. But Kevin knew from listening to Whitney's voice that she possessed the vulnerability and strength the character required. What he didn't expect was the electricity that would spark between them the moment she walked onto that soundstage. Whitney was terrified. This was her first major film role, and the pressure was overwhelming. She'd been losing sleep for weeks, worried about embarrassing herself in front of the cameras. But when Kevin extended his hand and said, "Welcome to our movie, Whitney," something shifted inside her. His presence was calming, protective, exactly like the Bodyguard character he was playing. But what started as professional chemistry quickly became something neither of them had anticipated. During their first rehearsal of the pivotal restaurant scene, director Mick Jackson called cut after watching them run through the dialogue. "That was beautiful," he said, "but you two look like you're actually falling in love with each other." Kevin and Whitney exchanged a glance that lasted just a moment too long. They both knew Mick was right. The problem was, they were both married. Kevin to his college sweetheart Cindy Silva, with whom he had 3 children. Whitney was engaged to Bobby Brown, planning a wedding that would take place just months after filming wrapped. Neither had been looking for love, but sometimes love doesn't wait for convenient timing. Their connection deepened during the intimate scenes. When they filmed the love scene in Rachel's bedroom, the entire crew fell silent watching them. It wasn't just acting. There was a tenderness between them that felt completely real. After Mick called cut, Whitney and Kevin stayed in each other's arms for several seconds longer than necessary, neither wanting to break the spell. That's when the late-night conversations began. After long days of shooting, instead of going straight home to their respective partners, Kevin and Whitney started finding excuses to stay on set. They'd sit in Kevin's trailer, talking about everything except the feelings that were growing stronger each day. Whitney told him about the pressure she felt to be perfect, about how lonely fame could be, even when surrounded by people. Kevin shared his own struggles with the isolation that came with success. "Sometimes I feel like I'm performing even when the cameras aren't rolling," Whitney confessed one evening as they sat on the steps of the soundstage, looking up at the stars. "Like I've forgotten who I really am underneath all the expectations." Kevin turned to look at her, and for a moment, she wasn't Whitney Houston, the superstar. She was just a woman who needed someone to see her for who she really was. "I see you," he said quietly. "The real you. And she's extraordinary." The breaking point came during the filming of Whitney's rendition of "I Will Always Love You." Kevin wasn't supposed to be there. It was just Whitney and the sound engineers. But something drew him to Studio A that night. When he quietly opened the door and heard Whitney singing Dolly Parton's song with a passion that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her soul, he understood that she was singing to him. The first take was beautiful, but Whitney shook her head. "Let me try again," she said into the microphone. Kevin watched from the shadows as she closed her eyes and began again. This time, every note carried the weight of everything they couldn't say to each other. Her voice soared with a pain so raw, so authentic, that the sound engineers stopped their work to listen. "And I will always love you," she sang, her voice breaking slightly on the word always. Kevin felt his chest tighten. She was pouring their entire relationship, the love, the longing, the impossibility of it all, into Dolly Parton's lyrics. By the third take, Whitney was crying, but she kept singing. Her voice, that magnificent instrument that had captivated millions, was now trembling with the weight of a love that could never be. Kevin found himself gripping the doorframe, fighting every instinct that told him to run to her, to hold her, to tell her that they could figure this out together. When she hit the final, impossible high note, sustaining it with a power that seemed to come from another realm, Kevin felt his knees buckle. The sound was so beautiful, so heartbreaking, that he had to cover his mouth to keep from sobbing out loud. This wasn't just a performance. It was a confession, a declaration, and a goodbye all wrapped into one perfect moment. As the last notes faded into silence, Whitney opened her eyes and looked through the glass. She saw Kevin standing there, tears streaming down his face, and she knew he understood every word she'd just sung. For several seconds, they just stared at each other across the studio, both understanding that she had just given voice to everything they felt, but could never express. That night, they finally talked about what was happening between them. "This is crazy," Whitney whispered as they walked along the empty Santa Monica pier after midnight. The ocean waves crashed rhythmically against the shore, providing a soundtrack to their whispered confessions. "I'm getting married in 3 months. Bobby's already planned the bachelor party. My dress is hanging in my closet. My mother is addressing wedding invitations." "I know," Kevin replied, his voice heavy with the weight of their impossible situation. "And I've got Annie, Lily, and Joe waiting for me at home. Cindy packed their lunches for school tomorrow. I read Joe a bedtime story about a knight who always kept his promises." He laughed bitterly. "But Whitney—" He stopped walking and turned to face her, the moonlight catching the anguish in his eyes. "What I feel for you is real, more real than anything I've felt in years." Whitney hugged herself against the cool ocean breeze, trying to hold herself together. "I feel it too. God help me, I feel it too. When I look at you, I see everything I didn't know I was searching for. But what are we supposed to do with that? Destroy 2 families? Hurt people we care about? Become a tabloid scandal?" The weight of their fame made everything more complicated. They couldn't even have this conversation without looking over their shoulders for photographers. Their love couldn't exist in the public eye without becoming a spectacle. Kevin reached out and gently touched her face, his thumb tracing away a tear she didn't realize had fallen. "I don't know. I just know that some connections transcend everything else. Maybe we're not meant to act on this, but that doesn't make it less real. That doesn't make it less valuable." Whitney leaned into his touch for just a moment, allowing herself to imagine a world where they could choose each other without consequence. "In another life," and she whispered, "we would have met differently. Maybe we would have been just Kevin and Whitney." "In that life," Kevin said softly, "I would have asked you to marry me." "I would have said yes," she replied, and they smiled. They stood there in the moonlight, two people who had found their perfect match at exactly the wrong time. When Kevin finally kissed her, it was gentle, desperate, and filled with all the love they couldn't express anywhere else. But even as they held each other, they both knew this moment would have to sustain them for the rest of their lives. The next day, they made an unspoken agreement to maintain professional distance, but everyone on set could feel the electricity between them. During the climactic scene where Frank saves Rachel from the assassin, Kevin's desperation as he shielded Whitney from danger was completely authentic. He wasn't acting. He was genuinely terrified of losing her. As filming neared its end, the tension between them became almost unbearable. They would catch each other staring during takes. Their hands would brush accidentally, sending electricity through both of them. The crew began whispering about the obvious chemistry, but Kevin and Whitney maintained the facade that they were just professional colleagues. The last day of shooting was agony. After Mick Jackson called the final wrap, there was the traditional cast party, but Kevin and Whitney could barely look at each other. Finally, as the party wound down, Whitney approached Kevin near the catering table. "Walk with me?" she asked quietly. They found themselves back on the same soundstage where they'd first met, now dark and empty. The magic of movie making had ended, and reality was waiting outside those doors. "I have something to tell you," Whitney said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was ready to leave Bobby. I was ready to ask you to leave Cindy. I was ready to risk everything." Kevin's heart stopped. "Was? But then I realized something. What we have is beautiful because it's pure. If we turned it into something messy, something that hurt innocent people, we'd destroy the very thing that makes it special." Kevin nodded, understanding flooding his eyes. "You're right. But Whitney, you need to know something too. In another life, in another time, You would have been the great love of my life. I already am, she whispered back, just not in the way we wanted. They kissed one final time, pouring 20 lifetimes of love into that single moment. When they finally pulled apart, they both knew it was goodbye. 3 months later, Kevin watched on television as Whitney married Bobby Brown in a lavish ceremony. His heart broke all over again, but he understood. Whitney was choosing the life that made sense, even if it wasn't the life her heart wanted. For the next 20 years, they maintained a respectful distance. Kevin would send flowers on Whitney's opening nights. Whitney would call to congratulate him on his movie successes. They were friendly, but they never allowed themselves to be alone together again. They both knew the connection was still there, still powerful, still dangerous. When Whitney began struggling with personal demons in the 2000s, Kevin watched from afar with a broken heart. He would read every article, watch every interview, looking for signs of the woman he'd fallen in love with beneath the headlines about erratic behavior and vocal problems. He wanted to help, wanted to be there for her, but he knew that his presence would only complicate her already complicated life. Instead, he sent messages through mutual friends, letting her know that someone still believed in her, still saw the woman he'd fallen in love with on that soundstage. There were nights when Kevin would lie awake, thinking about calling her. During her divorce from Bobby Brown, during the custody battles, during the comeback attempts that never quite materialized, he would dial her number and then hang up before it could ring. How do you tell someone you love them when you've spent 20 years pretending you don't? The last time they spoke was in 2010. Whitney had called to thank him for defending her in a recent interview where he'd praised her performance in The Bodyguard. You didn't have to do that, she said, and he could hear exhaustion in her voice, but also a hint of the old Whitney. Yes, I did, Kevin replied, settling into his favorite chair in his home office, the same one where he'd first read the Bodyguard script. Because everything I said was true. You were perfect in that movie, Whitney. You were perfect, period. There was a long pause filled with 20 years of unspoken words. When Whitney spoke again, her voice was softer, more vulnerable. Kevin, I want you to know that loving you, even the way we did, was one of the most beautiful experiences of my life. No regrets. Kevin closed his eyes, gripping the phone tighter. No regrets, he echoed, though his voice was thick with emotion. Not a single one. 2 years later, Kevin was at his ranch in Colorado when his phone rang. It was his publicist with news that would shatter his world. Whitney Houston had been found dead in a Beverly Hills hotel room. Kevin sat down heavily on his porch steps, the phone falling from his numb fingers. For the next hour, he sat there as the sun set over the mountains, remembering a young woman who had been afraid to act but brave enough to love him with her whole heart. He thought about her laugh, the way she would scrunch up her nose when she was thinking, the sound of her humming between takes. He thought about all the conversations they never had, all the moments they never shared, all the what-ifs that would die with her. At Whitney's funeral, Kevin delivered a eulogy that brought the entire church to tears. Standing at the podium in that Newark church where Whitney had first learned to sing, Kevin looked out at a congregation filled with music legends, movie stars, and ordinary people whose lives had been touched by Whitney's voice. You weren't just good enough, you were great, he said, his voice breaking with emotion as he looked directly at Whitney's casket. You were perfect. You were perfect. Most people thought he was talking about her talent, her voice, her performance in their movie. But Sissy Houston, sitting in the front row, caught his eye and nodded slightly. She knew. Somehow Whitney's mother knew that Kevin was talking about something much deeper than professional admiration. He was talking about a love that transcended time, circumstances, and possibility. A love that remained perfect precisely because it had never been tainted by the complications of reality. After the service, as Kevin stood by Whitney's casket while the church slowly emptied, he placed his hand on the polished wood and whispered words that only she would have understood. I will always love you, in this life and the next. Thank you for showing me what it feels like to find your other half. Even if we could never be together, knowing that love exists, that was enough. Whitney Houston and Kevin Costner found their soulmate in each other during the filming of The Bodyguard. But sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that remain unfinished. preserved in their perfection like flowers pressed between the pages of a book. What they shared was real, pure, and eternal, a love that needed no validation beyond the knowing that, for one brief moment in time, two hearts recognized each other across the noise of fame, obligation, and circumstance. Their love story wasn't about what they did together. It was about what they were willing to sacrifice to protect something beautiful from becoming something complicated. It was about choosing love over possession, devotion over destruction, and eternity over momentary gratification. Years later, when Kevin would watch The Bodyguard on television, he would see things that audiences missed. The way Whitney's eyes would soften whenever she looked at him. The protective way he held her during dangerous scenes. The chemistry that made their fictional romance so believable, it became one of cinema's most beloved love stories. But Kevin knew the truth. It wasn't acting. It was two people falling deeply, impossibly in love, and having the strength to let each other go when duty called. What they had was forever frozen at its most beautiful moment, that kiss on Santa Monica Pier under the moonlight, when anything seemed possible and love felt infinite. In the end, Kevin realized that Whitney had given him the greatest gift. She had shown him that a love like theirs could exist, that somewhere in this world, there was someone who could see the man behind all the roles. And if that kind of love could exist once, the world was truly more magical than he imagined. Their love story may not have had a fairy tale ending, but it had something better. It had truth, beauty, and purity that transcends time. In the end, that may be the most romantic love story of all.